Back in 1980, I was only 35. It was a different world back then, and I miss it. Sometimes, other times I'm perfectly satisfied that I live in a world where everyone under the age of 50 seems to be preoccupied with their computers and cell phones. It makes it easier to deal with people if they're not paying attention to you. I could go out to a public place and be perfectly alone, even if it is crowded. An old-timer like me, well, we don't mind being alone. And those of us who can pretty much see the end of the road have things to ponder. Big things like what happens after I die. Does death hurt? Is God real? Is the devil? Where will I go after death? Anywhere? Everywhere? Heaven? Hell? Where will I be stuck here wandering an unseen furry eternity? And if that's the case, there won't be much different than my life had been up until this point. I was one of the unseen my whole life. It only bothered me for a few years when I was a child. It's what those fancy psychiatrists or psychologists call the formative years. Maybe there's something to all that. And I'm so far past that period of life that it doesn't make a difference. Way back in 1945, I was born in a little mountain county in Tennessee. Population back then was around 500, give or take 50. And by the time I arrived on the scene, I had 2 older brothers. Mama had a kid every year for 3 years after Dad got back from the war. Then I had 5 more who lived after I was born. There were 2 stillbirths right after me. And that put Mama in a terrible way. They say her mind was never right afterward. I wouldn't know if I was too young to remember her any other way. She always seemed kind of sad and quiet. And sometimes she forgot to fix supper or some such. But I didn't know any different. It was normal to me. And I suppose my older brothers too, because we just threw in and did whatever chores she had missed that day. And we did it without complaint. My 2 older brothers were drafted into the Vietnam War. We thought I was going to be lucky, but that's something I ain't ever been. News of Tommy and Johnny's death came to us in 1968, just a month before I had to serve. War ain't the place for young people. Ain't a place for anybody. And even though my grandpa fought in World War I, and then my father in World War II, I was terrified when I left for my tour. Mama cried. Daddy stood with his chest puffed out. Proudest could be. And I still don't know why. He'd lost 2 sons to the war already. I came home at the end of 1970 and Mama cried again. Daddy shook my hand and said he was proud of me. The welcome home lasted all of 30 minutes. And then it was back to business that usual at the client farm. And I was right back to being unseen. I don't even know that they missed me when I left that morning before sunrise in the May of 1971. I bounced from one job to another for the better part of the decade. Every job was one in which I was unseen. Who notices the janitors, the maintenance men, stall muckers or landscapers? Well, because of all the political correctness nowadays, lots of people say they notice these people, even throw them a few dollars for a tip and a pained smile sometimes. They're liars, my opinion. No one really notices them. Hell, I know firsthand. But then in 1980, I found a job that nobody wanted and residents didn't want to know about. That was the guy who drove around and looked for roadkill to remove. It's not the most pleasant job in the world, but my time in the war had desensitized me to a lot of things, I suppose. Wasn't that bad, though? Not for me. There was the inconvenience of having to dispose of carcasses on a daily basis, but the perks were good too. I got to drive around by myself for 10 hours a day every day, Monday through Friday and 6 on Saturdays. All the while I could smoke my cigarettes and listen to all the country music I wanted. Another man did the Sunday shift so I could have 1 day off a week. He was a lazy schlub and worked only about half the time. But it was okay. Because of his laziness, I was raking in the money. I got paid double time to work some days. For months I worked as many days and hours as I could. I had a plan, you see. I was going to build up a good little nest egg over the next few years, and then I would worry about putting down roots, buying some property, building a house, and maybe even marry that doe-eyed little darling I'd been sweet on since before I left for the work. I'd gotten into a routine with my job earlier in the year, and by the time the last week of June rolled around, that's when my hours jumped from 10 a day to 14 a day through the week, 7 in the morning until 9 at night. And some days I wondered what good it did me to pay the $100 rent on that shitty little apartment. It was in addition to the side of a barn that sat nearly in the center of 5 acres, There was electricity, but no running water. I had one of those big plastic reservoirs that held around 200 gallons over the barn. I have an out-of-zinc tub over there for bathing too. Nice in the summer, mostly unusable in the winter. And with my work schedule, I was barely home except to bathe and sleep. The land had been unused for 6 years. The owner's sons had not come back from the war, unable or unwilling to deal with the loss. His wife swallowed a handful of volumes. And thus, another American dream became a nightmare, as everything Mr. Hilton had ever worked for and acquired withered away. First his family, then his livestock, and finally his land. He managed to hang on to about 7 acres. The land around the barn was his, but he never set foot on it anymore. Don Sims, the farmer down the road, had filled his land with livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, chickens, hell, you name a farm animal that he didn't have, and I'll eat your too. Don used the 5 acres around Hilton's barn, and sometimes he housed the few animals on the far side of it. It made for a stinky situation in the heat of the summer. Anyway, that was home from 1979 to 1983. In mid-July, the heat and the humidity were terrible. I learned to drive town roads early in the day and moved to the mountain roads during the worst of the heat. My truck was a 1975 model that didn't have air conditioning. One day in the first week of August, I noticed there was a lot of smaller animals like raccoons, small deer, coyotes, and rabbits on the side of Raven Hall or road. That sure was a remote rural road in the mountains that was used mostly by people who lived there, but that was kind of the point. There were only 6 families way up that mountain, and only 4 cars between them all. B. Wilder, and I stopped to dispose of the second coyote. Now back then, we didn't always haul the carcass to a landfill. Instead, we pulled the body off into the woods and buried it if we could, but threw it into the designated carcass pit if there was one, or we left it to decompose naturally, which was the option I chose for the coyotes and most other animals on mountain roads. As I dragged the second coyote, I couldn't help but notice the thing's through, and part of one side of its head was gone. Smashed and bashed. I was used to. You see, vehicles do a lot of nasty damage. But this thing looked like something else. Not like it had been hit by a car. It was hotter than the devil's armpit. So I didn't pay it too much attention. I just wanted to be done and move on. As I got back in the truck, I wondered about the missing part of the animal's head. What could have done it? Bear, most likely. But why would a coyote be anywhere near bear? Now every 200 or 300 feet, I had to pull over and drag or carry another animal off the road and into the woods, 9 times in all. I reached the Todd property, and I turned in their driveway and headed toward the mountain. It was getting darker by the minute, and I was looking forward to a cool bath and some shut-eye. About halfway down Ravenholler Road, I spotted a large black wolf laying at the edge of the road. I slowed down and I flipped on my spotlight. It was a large, black wolf, all right. I'd just been at the same spot to move a coyote, though, and there had been no other animals in sight. I hadn't even heard one roaming around in the woods. Not to mention I was sitting in my truck with a spotlight shining down in a huge black wolf. Now I didn't immediately shut off the engine and step out. I sat there looking at something I didn't think was supposed to exist in Tennessee. I only knew about the red wolves that were native back when my grandfather was young, and even those I had never seen. But this wolf was massive. Its front legs were long and thin with muscles that reminded me of a boy I knew in school who was whipped thin and loved to run. Its paws were easily as big as my hand. I looked up the road and then back to the dead wolf. I could leave it until the next day, but there is no way I was going to drag its carcass into the woods to decompose. It was too dark for that shit, especially since something had killed such a massive predator within the last 20 minutes. Had to be a bear. I thought scanning the woods with the spotlight. I didn't see anything. All I saw was forest and craggy mountain ground, same as always, and that dead wolf, of course. I would have to put the carcass in the truck, cover it with a tarp, and take it home with me. The next morning I could take it by the TDOT office and then to the landfill. If there are too many carcasses on the roads, or ones in the pits and whatnot, haven't been decayed enough, I had to take the bodies to the landfill. And I knew there was a coyote a few yards into the woods near where the wolf lay. He needed to go to the landfill, but I didn't want to get out and haul him up into the truck bed. He was almost as big as me. Using the spotlight, and I scanned the woods on my side of the road. Not a thing. If I left the damn wolf, I would have to get him the next day. And it would be the same process, only he might be starting to stink by then. Or maybe have maggots all over him. Cussing, I shoved my foot into the park brake pedal, and I opened the door. I had a pistol, but I didn't really believe the pea shooter would save me if whatever had killed the wolf came back. There was no blood around the body. I stopped a few feet from it, and I put my hands on my knees to look closer. Its tongue drooped out of its mouth, and at the end of it touched the pavement. No living creature would lay there like that. But still, no blood. How had it died? Was it possibly only stunned? Now I pulled the pistol, and I trained it on the wolf's head as I inched closer. The stench of death curled up around my face. It hadn't been dead long enough to start thinking. But it definitely smelled like 3-day-old roadkill. I moved close enough to kick its massive back paw. The whole animal wobbled from the force, but its eyes didn't open, and its tongue was still lolled out. I thought about putting a bullet through its eye just to make sure it was really dead before I tried to move it. But if there was a bigger predator out there, and logic dictated there was, the gunshot might draw it. Hey, it obviously wasn't afraid of a wolf or a coyote. I had no reason to think it would fear something that sounded like a really loud clap. Whatever killed all the animals might have even had rabies for all I knew. I'd be wearing my thick rubber apron and gloves each time I touched a carcass. Same as always. But thick rubber apron and gloves wouldn't be any protection from a rabid bear. I'd never heard of a rabid bear, but I knew it was possible for them to become infected. A vehicle didn't kill the wolf. There had been no cars or trucks on the road except for mine. And there was nowhere to turn around. It wasn't like someone hit the wolf and then turned around to head back down the mountain. There was no blood, so that ruled out a hunter shooting it. It ruled out an animal attack too. I went back to the truck, and I positioned the spotlight so it shone into the woods behind the wolf. And then I grabbed a wide flat shovel, some rope, and a tarp. I spread the tarp on the road and threaded the rope through some of the holes on each side. To get leverage, I had to get on the opposite side of the wolf and expose my back to the woods, pushing the blade of the shovel under the ribs, and to the other side of him. I forced the handle upward. I wasn't expecting to strain as much as I did, but he was heavier than I thought, longer too. From the tip of his nose to his haunches, I bet he was at least 6.5 feet long. I worked with the shovel until he rolled onto the tarp and I tied the edges together. Threw the shovel back into the truck, and I stood there sweating and slowing my breathing. As I looked to the half-fast block and tackle rig, something moved in the forest, just to the side of the spotlight's beam. I turned in that direction, and then held my breath. The movement ceased only after a few seconds, but I put a fire under my backside, and I hurried to finish the task. Now at that same time the forest was silent, too silent for my liking. For the first time in a long time, I felt like something was hiding out there in the dark. Something that wanted to hurt me. Kill me. I hadn't felt that since I was in the war. I was calmer when I could do the rest of the work from the bed of the truck. Not that I was sheltered, but I did have the high ground, so to speak. Several minutes and a lot of fun angling later, the dead wolf thumped into the bed at my feet. I had come to feel as if the roads I kept clear of carcasses were my roads. Not just my responsibility, but mine in a prideful ownership kind of way. And I didn't want dead things littering up my roads. State of the roads was a direct reflection on me and what kind of man I was. But I was happy to drive off that mountain and leave all the questions behind. At home, I parked the truck in my side of the barn, and I closed the doors. Don had been there and put pigs and goats in the other end of the barn. There were 2 sets of rickety double doors constructed of salvaged woods, separating the 2 halves of the barn. They did nothing to slow down the smell of shit, or to dampen the bleeding and blatting and snorting of penned-up animals. Stepping out, I shut the doors and secured them with a board before going inside to get a change of clothes. No way I was getting into bed without a bath that night. A few minutes later, I had the zinc tub filled and I was climbing in, when I heard a sound that didn't come from Don's livestock. It hadn't come from the other half of the barn. It was on my side, close, and a pit formed in my stomach. The bear bulbed strong over a rafter near the side door didn't offer much light. I listened hard. Sweat oozed from the pores on my face and the back of my neck, even as a chill swept upward from the base of my spine. My pea shooter of a pistol lay on the hood of the truck 15 or 20 feet away, bathed in darkness. I had nothing to defend myself with, except for the rough wood stool holding my change of clothes and a bar of soap. That noise didn't come again. I stood there, buck-ass naked for a full minute. Then for good measure I waited another full minute. I counted off the seconds silently, hands clenched into fists, toes curled against the bottom of the tub. The only sounds came from the pigs and goats. Maybe I had imagined the other sound. That's what I tried to tell myself anyway. Unclenching my fists, I turned and I looked around again. Satisfied that there was no movement, I forced myself not to give in to the panic in my gut. Now, post-war paranoia is a thing. I found that it can, and it will consume a man the very second he gives in to it. With me, getting out of that tub to get the gun, search the barn or retreat into the house without bathing would have set off that paranoia. You see, a man could get locked into that state of mind and there's no limit on how long he'll be that way. So I set my ass down into the water with my head on a swivel. I groaned and silently cursed myself for being a chicken shit. And that's what it boiled down to, right? I was just scared. I grabbed the bar of soap and I started bathing off as quickly as I could, and I faked bravado. Faked until you make it, right? While I splashed water to rinse my chest and shoulders, the distinct crackle of moving tarps startled me. For a millisecond I kept going. My handful of water sloshed around the base of my neck and ran down my chest. With then the tarp moved again. I spun to face the truck and stood all in one motion. There was no way I was imagining that. The wind didn't cause it. There was no wind, and the truck's that far away enough from a singular overhead bulb that only the driver's side was dimly lit. I couldn't see into the bed. It was lost in blackness just like everything else over there. So I slowly stepped out of the tub. I mean, that wolf had been dead. There was no way it was moving in the tarp. Rat, my mind suggested, desperately grasping at any straw. Rat ate into his gut and just came out. That's gotta be it. But you see, I knew better. The wolf had been very dead and very intact when I loaded him up. Claws scraped against the metal bed of the truck, and something growled. Now I didn't know what to do, which way to turn or what to think. I was paralyzed, eyes wide, and staring in horror and disbelief at the bed of the truck, as the wolf leaped out and landed only a few feet from me. Its eyes glowed bluish-white, and deep in the center, a fiery red. We locked eyes, and I knew I wasn't seeing a large wolf. I was witnessing something not meant to be witnessed by humans. He moved towards me, and I thought that was it. I would be viciously mauled and left to hold my guts and moan as I bled out onto the dirt floor, and there was nothing I could do about it. My body wouldn't respond to my commands. The goats began to scream. It was the screams of fear, of pure panic, and they must have picked up the scent of the thing standing in front of me. The wolf's head snapped in that direction. It turned its whole body towards the divider doors and took one step. Then another, and it looked back at me and snarled, emitting a low, gravely growl that must have come from the pits of hell. Its shining eyes assessed me from head to toe, and then turned away again as if completely disinterested. I guess it figured I wasn't the threat, or maybe the piss running down my leg made me seem less appetizing. The wolf pulled itself into a standing position, standing like a man. The sounds of its bones cracking echoed in my ears as I booked into the apartment where I had guns and knives and doors to put between me and that hellish beast. And for the next 30 minutes, I stood in the dark, looking out the small window toward the barn with the butt of my rifle against my shoulder and my knees trembling. God, you see the sounds from those goats and pigs? That was the most heart-wrenching sound I'd ever heard outside of a gut-shot man dying in the ground of Vietnam. By the next morning, all the animals were silent. I was running on autopilot by them, so I did the only thing I knew to do. Let's stuck to my routine. I ignored that the double doors in the barn were open when I went in to dump the water from the zinc tub and get my truck. I ignored the bloody, torn-apart animals scattered on my side of those doors. I whistled the tune to Clementine, got my truck out of the barn, closed the doors I had opened, and went to work. Now Don Sims, sheriff, my landlord, and the local veterinarian were there when I returned that evening. The sheriff had set up lights in the yard, and the doors on my side of the barn were open. I shook my head and I rubbed my chin right along with the rest of them as they pondered what could have orchestrated such a bloody slaughter. "That's bear, most likely," I said, nodding as I looked over the ripped-apart animals in the strewn intestines, or mountain lion. "Hell, we have them too. And you know how they love small livestock." Don scowled and shook his head. "A no-normal mountain lion just slaughtered his animals like this, and best we could tell only one goat is missing. Rest of them are just torn apart and scattered." He stepped closer to me and shoved his hands into his pockets. His eyes narrowed. "Now you didn't hear this massacre going on? Thing like this don't happen in silence." I lied. I lied through my teeth, and I'm not ashamed to say so. I mean, what in the hell was I going to tell them? That a dead wolf I hauled home reanimated and let me live but wasted all of his animals? How about the part where the wolf stood on 2 legs and began to change into a human-looking creature? Yeah, that would have gotten me socked right into this asylum for life. Another war, that, with a cracked mind. That's what they would have thought. So I lied. I heard nothing. No, sir. I hadn't parked in the barn last night. The animals sounded fine when I went out to bathe, and they sounded a little quiet, but still fine when I left for work. Truth is, nothing was ever fine after that, especially not me. You see, I'm a see-it-to-believe-it type of man. I never believe any of the hanked and bogus stories about monsters in the Appalachian Mountains, but after that night, though, I've never been sure what stories to believe after that. You see, if that thing exists, hell, anything can exist. Anything at all. And I'm right back to square one with my own pondering. Is God real? The devil? Where will I go when I die? Heaven? Hell? Nowhere. Perhaps everywhere.